based on the differences between the two parties, we should be able to reach an agreement. If you just look at, let's take out some of the things that Hamas put in that are completely unworkable and that go beyond positions it has previously taken, because we don't think that's a good faith action to have an agreement, or at least have accepted terms and then move the terms. Take out some of those areas. If you look at the remaining areas, we do think it should be possible to come to an agreement. Doesn't mean we will, but that the benefits to the region, the people of Gaza, the people of Israel, are so significant that we're going to continue to work to try to reach such an agreement.
And how does the U.S. intend to hold Israel accountable for honoring these tactical pauses? We've seen a number of instances where they said that areas were protected, that humanitarians would be protected, and then ultimately the results on the ground don't bear that out.
So ultimately we judge Israel by the results. And when it comes to either, it's not just a question of humanitarian pauses, it's to the question of how much aid gets delivered. The pause ultimately is only a means to an end. The humanitarian pause is to ensure that, number one, aid can get delivered where it needs to go, and number two, relief workers have certainty that they can carry out their jobs without being hit by an airstrike or by tank fire or by any other kind of ordinance. So it's important that Israel has put this step in place, and we'll watch how it's implemented. And if there are changes that need to be made, we of course won't hesitate to make that clear.
Can I just ask one thing on that? You said we will judge Israel by the results. So it was April the 4th, President Biden basically threatened Israel to put conditions on aid if it wouldn't do a better job of protecting civilians and if more humanitarian aid wouldn't go into Gaza. It's been more than 2 months. U.S. government has taken no action and also has not basically made an assessment on how well or not Israel has done. So I don't quite understand the judgment part.
So it's because we have seen them take steps that have been productive, not always perfect in every instance, but let me just go through some of them. So we saw after that phone call and after the president made clear that our policy would be dependent on the results, we saw the opening of Zekum, we saw the opening of Erez Crossing, we saw the opening of Ashdod for deliveries to come in, we saw the opening of the Jordan route, so you now have trucks that are coming directly from Jordan, crossing through Israel, in some cases crossing through the West Bank and going directly to the north. It's a significant improvement. Now, we also saw in the south initially an increase in the number of trucks in, but then barriers since the beginning of the Rafah operation. So what we judge Israel by is, now that we have somewhat stabilized, not by any chance gotten the north to where it needs to be, but at least stabilized the situation from where it was 2 months ago. How do we improve the situation in the north in the south in the wake of the Rafah operation? The humanitarian pause is one step that we wanted to see them do to help improve that situation. There are others that we continue to work with them on.
But Matt, aid groups say in the north it's gotten just as bad as it was before.
So we have seen, so we don't have people on the ground to make an assessment. We will look to the groups that make assessments to tell us what the actual situation is. But you have seen a significant increase in assistance going into the north. Before that phone call, there wasn't a large amount of assistance that was going in. Everyone knows those stories very well. We have now seen assistance going in. Now, look, when we see reports from humanitarian groups, say the IPC that issues reports from time to time, we will take a look at those, and if there are things that need to change, we won't hesitate to be direct with Israel about how they need to make those changes. But we have seen an improvement in the aid situation going in the north, and we've seen somewhat of a stagnation in the south, and that's what we want to see reversed.
But that improvement in the steps didn't actually translate into results, because you just said that the distribution hasn't improved, and that has a lot to do, especially in the south, with the start of the Rafah operation. Okay, it's not the major, you guys don't call it the major military operation, but in the end, it basically obstructed the delivery of aid, and that was an action taken by Israel.
So the point I made, it's not just the Rafah operation. There has also been attacks on trucks, attacks on humanitarian convoys coming in by common criminals and looters. That isn't an action taken by the government of Israel, but it's something that we're looking to work with Israel and our UN partners and others to try to resolve and try to find an answer to.
Okay, final thing on this. Is the US government actually going to give itself a certain time frame on when to deliver or make an assessment on what the president said on April the 4th?
It is an ongoing assessment every day. We're every day.
Well,
we
if
are,
there is an assessment, then there's got to be an action.
No, it is every day we are looking at seeing if there are improvements being made, if there are actions that the government of Israel is taking that are sufficient, and it is something that is ongoing. And I said this at the time. You shouldn't look for a magic date where we're going to look and go, okay, everything's fine now. We are going to look at this all the time and make sure that if assistance isn't going in at the level it needs to, that we push the government of Israel to take action to get humanitarian assistance in. If there are things that the UN agencies need to do to further resolve logistical hurdles, we want to work with them to try to resolve those logistical hurdles, because ultimately our goal is to get as much humanitarian assistance in as possible. I should say, however, that we've been going over this for months because of the inherent difficulty of delivering humanitarian assistance in the middle of a conflict. The best way to resolve this and to surge humanitarian assistance in and get through a number of these logistical hurdles and security hurdles would be a ceasefire. It's why we continue to push to try to get a ceasefire agreement, because not every one of these issues, but a number of these issues that are presented by trying to deliver aid in the middle of an ongoing conflict would be at least mitigated, if not fully resolved. Yeah.
You talked about the dissolution of the Israeli war cabinet, said this was an internal matter, but it's not an internal matter if it affects who is in the direct line of decision-making over the use of US military assistance and US weapons, particularly in relation to this war. And we know it seems very likely now that the ministers for national security and finance will be a far more significant part of that decision-making process. Does that concern you? We
ultimately judge the decisions that the government of Israel makes, as we do with other governments, on the policy outcomes those decisions produce, not on the people making them. That's true no matter who is in the government. It will continue to be true.
But these are people you've repeatedly criticized for, I think, what you call destabilizing rhetoric, for, effectively what are their values. One is a convicted supporter of terrorism. Another has openly called for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. So if these people are now, in a direct line of decision-making over the war in Gaza, surely that's a concern for you.
So those are people who have always been in the cabinet, and we have made clear when they take actions that we disagree with. We've made that clear publicly, and I can tell you we've had some very direct conversations privately as well with the senior members of the government of Israel about those policies that we think are unproductive, not only to the plight of the Palestinian people, but to Israel's security. Ultimately, though, it is not for us to pass judgment on who ought to be in the government of Israel or who ought to not be in the government of Israel, or into the cabinet. That's just not a decision for the United States to make. We don't decide who is in the cabinet of any other country. That is a decision for the people of Israel to make. Ultimately, what our job is to interact with whatever government they choose and make clear what we think the policies they should pursue that are in their best interest and the best interest of the region. And we're going to do that whoever is in the government. Now, that said, when we see decisions when we see decisions with which we disagree, we will not hesitate to make those disagreements known. And that has been true before the dissolution of the war cabinet, and it will continue to be true.
But no one's asking you to decide who's in the cabinet, but you frequently have views on members of other governments, and this is one of your closest allies. So based on the policy decisions that they take, and so that's what I'm trying to speak to. When members of that government have made policy decisions with which we disagree, we speak out on those, and that will continue to be the case. That was the case before the war cabinet. It was the case when the war cabinet decided things that we didn't agree with, and that'll be our guiding principle going forward, no matter who is in the government, going one way or the other. And do you have any policies or protocols on convicted terrorism supporters being in a key part of the decision making over a war being conducted by your ally in using U.S. military assistance?
Ultimately, we expect governments that receive U.S. military assistance to operate in line with international humanitarian law. That'll continue to be our expectation of Israel and everybody else. Go ahead.
Thanks, Matt. So one question first on administrative detention. So you've discussed how civilians shouldn't be held as leverage with regards to, of course, the Israeli hostages. Israel has held thousands of Palestinians in administrative detention for months with no trial or charge. our colleagues at CNN and the New York Times, of course, recently reported on a prison camp where thousands were rounded up and allegedly abused, tied up, assaulted, stripped. They're kept away from legal support and the Red Cross. And of course, Israel has said they're moving away from that specific camp. But what's being done to ensure this kind of thing doesn't happen again? What consequences are there? And then what about this larger issue of detention where thousands of Palestinians are just rounded up with apparent no legal or judicial accountability?
So we have made clear to the government of Israel on a number of occasions that they need to respect the human rights of Palestinians in both Gaza and in the West Bank, and that whenever anyone is detained, there needs to be full due process for those individuals, and they need to be treated in strict compliance with international humanitarian law.
Okay, so will there be any sort of like material response to this specific camp beyond just, of course, this one's shutting down? But
I can't speak to this specific one. Ultimately, our expectation is that they ought to give people due process. They ought to treat them treat them with full respect for their human rights and with in full accordance with international humanitarian law.
And then on your mention of the West Bank, Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, reported recently on Israeli snipers killing 7 innocent bystanders in the Jenin refugee camp, which is, of course, to say not Gaza. The dead included 2 teenagers and reportedly the director of the government hospital surgical ward. So these are soldiers putting 7 people into their lens, sniping them. They have the moment to see who these people are. It's in the West Bank. What's the explanation for this?
So I can't give you an explanation. You should ask the government of Israel for an explanation. I would say that in any kind of incident like that, what ought to happen is that there ought to be an investigation. Israel ought to conduct an investigation. If it's IDF soldiers, the IDF ought to conduct the investigation. If it's INP, it ought to be the INP that conducts an investigation. If there is, if they find wrongdoing, there ought to be full accountability and full transparency.
Has the U.S. communicated with Israel on this issue at all?
I'd have to check to see if we've raised a specific incident, but that is our broad expectation when it comes to any of these types of incidents.
And then just one quick question on Ukraine. When exactly, was the ban on arms transfers to the Azov Brigade lifted?
I'll have to come back and get you that. I know we've spoken to it before, but I don't have it at my fingertips.
Okay,
But
thank you.
yeah, Alan.
Can you say whether has been any change in position or stance on weapons deliveries to Israel in the past week or since the beginning of Blinken's visit? There have been, you might have noticed, some unsourced and unattributed news reports saying that they promised to release all restrictions. That Blinken told Netanyahu that.
Yeah, I did see those reports. So 2 things. Well, number 1, no, I don't have any updates to give. But number 2, just as a general matter, when you see reports in the Israeli media of things that the secretary supposedly said in his meetings with Israeli government, you should not always assume that those reports are entirely accurate. Yeah, go ahead.
A few minutes ago, you described the persons or groups that have been attacking some of the aid trucks at some of the Gaza crossings as, I think, criminals and looters, were your words. Has there been any sort of internal discussions within the State Department about determining whether this is like an organized action against aid trucks or whether this is truly some sort of disorganized band of criminals? And if you have had those discussions, has the U.S. raised any of these concerns about aid trucks being attacked with the Israeli government?
The answer to the second question, yes, we have raised it with the Israeli government. It's been a topic of discussion with our UN partners as well. This isn't anything that's new. It's an issue that has kind of gone up and down over time. There have been times before where aid trucks were being attacked by criminals, and then you've seen the aid diverted and sold on the black market. At times it's less of a problem, and it recently has been an issue again that has limited the distribution of some of the humanitarian assistance inside Gaza. So it is something that we have worked with not just Israel, but with UN organizations as well. As to whether it's systemic, it's not something I can speak to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Now that the Rafah crossing is closed, aid workers now have to go through Kerem Shalom, but the Israelis are putting more restrictions on them? I'm just wondering what your message to the Israeli government is about that.
So two things. First of all, that we need to reopen Rafah crossing, and that's something we've been working on with the government of Israel and the government of Egypt to try to find a way to safely reopen Rafah crossing in a way that can allow humanitarian workers to leave in the way that they were doing before the crossing was closed, and in a way that would allow humanitarian assistance to come in. So that is ultimately our goal, is to try to get Rafah back open. In the meantime, yes, we have worked to try to facilitate the rotation of humanitarian workers through Kerem Shalom. So aid workers that are in Gaza for some period of time that need to come out to rest, to see their families, and be replaced by others, so that can happen. There has been some rotation of aid workers through Kerem Shalom, and we continue to try to work to get additional rotations, because it's important that humanitarian workers both be able to go in and be able to come out so they can do their jobs. It is vital, life-saving work that they need to do, and it's something we continue to work through with the government of Israel.
They say the Israelis are making them stay longer, though, which makes it hard to find people to do it. Is there specific reasons that the Israelis are giving you about?
I just can't get into that level of detail from here. I can tell you that it's something Lise Grande, our special envoy for Middle East humanitarian issues, has been focused on, of how to get humanitarian workers in, get enough of them in, and get them out to rest, as I said. How long they stay is not something that is not a level of detail I can get into, but I know it's been a high priority and something that she interfaces with the aid organizations directly on, and then with the Israeli government to try to solve. Ultimately, as I said, the solution needs to be to get Rafah back open, but in the interim, doing nothing is not a sufficient outcome either.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
One other question on what you said earlier related to the issues of aid access, and one issue being, of course, connection to folks on the ground in the north.
What in the north?
Folks on the ground in the north in terms of aid distribution. Of course, one pivotal group that's operated there is, of course, UNRWA, a group that has had issues from the Israeli government in accessing and operating there, and one in which, of course, the U.S. has also withdrawn funding. So I'm wondering, have you interfaced with the government of Israel on specifically UNRWA's ability to access and operate? And then secondarily, what is the future of U.S. support for UNRWA? I know it's been months of this ongoing open investigation.
So with respect to the first question, yes, it's something that we have communicated directly with the Israeli government, and we have made clear that UNRWA plays a vital role in the distribution of humanitarian assistance in Gaza, and that work should not be in any way obstructed, because they are, in many cases, the only means of delivering humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people. And we've seen them continue to do that, despite the controversy around UNRWA, and despite some of the rhetoric you hear out of the Israeli government. UNRWA's continued to play that role over the 8 months of this conflict. Second, with respect to the U.S. posture, there's a law that passed by Congress, and so we are now restricted from providing direct budget support from to UNRWA. We don't have the ability to. That said, the investigation that the UN has conducted, you saw one of them that finished. There's another investigation that is ongoing. We wait to see the results of that. But ultimately, we have to follow the law that's passed by the Congress, and the law right now says that we cannot provide any direct budget support to UNRWA.